Welcome to this very special interview with the Managing Director of International Monetary Fund, Ms. Christine Lagarde. It's my pleasure to have you, ma.
Pleasure for me too, thank you.
Well, this is the second time you're coming to Nigeria. The first was during the last administration, and you're in Nigeria having interacted with the stakeholders. So what do you make of Nigeria from that time to now? What picture do you have in mind?
A lot has changed since December 2011. I would say that what I regard as a very, very important development in Nigeria is the fact that a democratic, peaceful transition has occurred on the occasion of the last presidential election. And that is critically important as a political signal, but also in terms of economic stability and predictability. If you look at the global economy at large, a lot has happened as well. The emerging market economies, which in 2011 were driving the bus of growth and providing 80% of that, are now slowing down. Whether you look at China, deliberately slowing, Russia, affected by the oil price decline, Brazil, a mixture of all that plus fiscal issues. That massive growth has stalled quite a bit, has been partly substituted by a recovery of the advanced economies led by the US. But the whole picture has changed. The third factor, which is very different as well, is the price of oil, which from an average of about $100+ per barrel has now moved down to $35, $36 per barrel. And it's probably not going to go, higher than that for a long, long time. So those are very, very different factors which are affecting the picture, which are going to require some prompt policy reconsideration, and Nigeria will not be alone in that respect, but will have to do that job too.
Okay, well, when we talk about Nigeria's economy, some experts continue to harp on the potential we have in this great country, essentially in the non-oil sector. What would be your assessment? Because Nigeria has witnessed growth at 6 to 7%, say in 2014, and in Q1 of 2015, we dropped to 4%. Q2, we moved to 2.4%. Yes, and in the third quarter, we stood at an initial, let me say, marginal increase of 2.8 going to 2016. What are your economic projections?
Well, our forecast is that from a 3.2%, which is our assessment for the annual growth in 2015, growth is going to be a little bit better than that, but not the 6% that we saw in 2014. So it's a slight recovery from the 2015 pretty grim numbers. I would say that, while in 2007, 2008, the non-oil sector was a strong component of the recovery and resilience of the Nigerian economy, the non-oil sector is also slowing down in Nigeria. And that is partly caused by the leverage that they have taken up, the sometimes US-denominated loans that they have taken, and the tightening of cheap financing around the world is also affecting the large corporate Nigerian operators. So while diversified in terms of contribution to GDP, while fairly strong as a non-oil sector, that component of the Nigerian economy also needs to reposition itself, needs to strengthen its competitiveness, and needs to refocus on the new terms of doing business in Nigeria.
Well, talking about refocusing and all that, you talked about 3 steps for emerging economies whose witnessing a slowdown in its growth. You recommended the need to stimulate demand, ensure fiscal stability, and also structure or implement structural reforms. How apt is this for Nigeria, and what areas will you be looking at in that direction?
For the Nigerian economy, I would say that the authorities have to concentrate on the immediate short-term issues, which are predominantly exchange rate, fiscal discipline, monetary policy, But they also have to take into account the medium-term imperatives of improving the infrastructure, of strengthening the power industry of Nigeria, and improving the public services that the Nigerian people legitimately expect in terms of health, in terms of education. So it's a combination of short-term imperatives of three dimensions: monetary, fiscal, and exchange rate, and the medium and long term, which requires action now, so that the competitiveness of the Nigerian economy can restore its external position.
We're talking about currency exchange and all that. It takes my mind to the financial sector reforms in Nigeria. I'm sure you are very much at home with that. How would you assess that in trying to ensure that we have a currency that could compete very well with international currencies? Essentially the call for devaluation and all that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that the financial sector has been significantly restructured. From 90 plus banks, Nigeria is now down to 20-ish banks, which is probably a lot safer than it was 5-6 years ago. So the financial sector is pretty solid, although is not completely exempt of potential risks, given the vulnerability of the corporate sector and the risk that non-performing loans actually keep rising, which would be a threat to the balance sheet of some of the Nigerian banks. But I'm not overly concerned about the financial sector that you referred to. The second point that you mentioned is the issue of the currency and the value of the naira relative to the dollar, for instance, where clearly there is a tension caused by the shortage of supply and the still very strong demand of foreign currencies. And that tension, if it is a sustainable tension, which we believe it is, needs to be addressed by way of a slightly more flexible exchange rate mechanism. So I'm not suggesting that a devaluation is needed. I'm suggesting that in order to absorb the shock to the economy, you need a combination of responses, which includes fiscal response by way of discipline and a medium-term anchoring of fiscal discipline. You need structural reforms to ensure that competitiveness will be restored and more manufacturing will take place locally, for instance. And you need flexibility in the mechanism.
Well, a lot of people are looking at the impact of low prices of oil on the nation's economy. What recommendations will you make for Nigeria to be able to withstand the shocks from this, essentially with the budget getting substantial amount from the oil sector?
Well, in those situations, it doesn't grow in the trees, right? And when oil prices are down, and probably for the longer term rather than the shorter term, one needs to adjust. When you have less money to spend, you try to find alternative sources of financing. So we are recommending that the VAT base, for instance, be enlarged. We are very strongly recommending that there be better collection of tax, less leakages, less evasion, more compliance. And a lot can actually be collected if everybody puts their mind to it and everybody understands that it's for the good of the Nigerian economy at large.
You've interacted with the policymakers and other stakeholders in Nigeria. What role do you think IMF will play in supporting Nigeria come out of the woods and be on the path of growth and development?
The IMF has a duty to give policy advice, can offer technical assistance and capacity building, which we do in the case of Nigeria and will continue to do at the request of the Nigerian authorities. The third assistance that the IMF provides is by way of lending and programs when the situation is such that there is no alternative financing and when the balance of payment is in a risky position. It's not the case for Nigeria at the moment, thank goodness. And if the authorities very promptly address the situation of the changed circumstances and its impact on fiscal and its impact on the currency with the right set of policies, an IMF program is not needed. The Nigerian authorities can make their own program, if I may say, and actually address the situation by changing the terms under which it operates.
Well, Nigeria is a member of among the 188 members of the IMF, and we ought to benefit from whatever facilities that are on ground to ensure that we're able to drive growth and development in our country. And talking about that, some members are a bit apprehensive of conditionalities of IMF. And I know since you assumed office in about 2011, you brought to bear a lot of reforms to make such conditions country-specific. Would you want to talk along that line?
In difficult circumstances, when the right measures have not been taken on time by the authorities, when no financing is available, then the authorities turn to the IMF for lending under conditions. We don't finance infrastructure projects. We don't finance development. The World Bank does that. The IMF lends short-term for countries to get back on their feet, restore their public finance, and return to normal financing conditions. But as we do that, we lend the international community money. And the conditions for the IMF to do that is that the country that benefits from that loan will actually reform its economy, will restore its public finances, and will guarantee that the money is reimbursed and that it will ultimately return to normal financing. So that's what we do. We always have to make it country-specific. You know, it's not a one-size-fits-all, because it's going to depend on the structure of the economy, it's going to depend on the stage of development, it's going to depend on the political determination and the ownership of the program by the authorities, and all of that is going to have to be tailored and the program designed and made to measure in order to guarantee the outcome, which is the country returns to normal financing, the lenders, the international community is repaid, and there is sustainable debt going forward. That's what we have to look at. But then we make it country-specific.
Okay. Well,
it's, you know, more than, I don't like the word conditionalities. It's actually a contract.
Okay.
It's a partnership, if you will. The country accesses financing that is not otherwise available, and in consideration for that, it undertakes to reform its economy so that it doesn't need that alternative financing anymore.
Okay, Nigeria's budget for 2016 is put at about 6 trillion naira, and part of that, about 2.2 trillion naira, is expected to be borrowed, as the case may be, having that deficit. And in trying to drive that, you were quoted as saying that Nigeria has no need for loans. How would you reconcile it?
Nigeria has no need for a program with the IMF at the moment, as we speak, because, you know, the IMF, as I said, provides loans in the situation where a country cannot access financing on the markets and has a balance of payment that is so damaged that it cannot honor its obligations to external parties. We are not in that situation.
Okay. In Peru, you talked about, among the talking points were that of illicit financial flows, which has remained a challenge to sub-Saharan Africa, essentially countries like Nigeria that produce oil. And one is wondering what IMF and other international development agencies are doing to assist developing nations like Nigeria, you know, come out of the way, repatriate some of these fundings.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. The first thing to do is to stop the leakages. And to help that, the IMF provides technical assistance, capacity building, and encourages and gives the technical devices to the authorities to make sure that there is no leakage. What we cannot provide, either by way of selling, lending, or making up, is the political drive and courage